Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 13th chapter of the 5th book of Vom Kriege. The text follows. What remains now to be said as to an advantageous position for cantonments is that they should be taken up behind some natural obstacle of ground, affording cover, whilst the sides next to the enemy can be watched by small but numerous detached parties. Or they may be taken up behind fortresses which, then circumstances prevent any estimates being formed of the strength of their garrisons, impose upon the enemy a greater feeling of respect and of caution. We reserve the subject of winter quarters covered by defensive works for a separate article. The quarters taken up by troops on a march differ from those called standing cantonments in this way that, in order to save the troops from unnecessary marching, cantonments on a march are taken up as much as possible along with the lines of march, and are not at any considerable distance on either side of these roads. If their extension in this sense does not exceed a short day's march, the arrangement is not one at all unfavorable to the quick concentration of the army. In all cases in presence of the enemy, according to the technical phrasing used, that is, in all cases where there is no considerable interval between the advance guards of the armies respectively, the extent of the cantonments and the time required to assemble the army determine the strength and position of the advanced guard and outposts. But when these must be suited to the enemy and circumstances, then, on the contrary, the extent of the cantonments must depend on the time which they can count upon the resistance of the advance guard. In the 3rd chapter, which is actually the 8th, of this book, we have stated how this resistance, in the case of an advance corps, may be estimated. From the time of that resistance, we must deduct the time required for transmission of reports and getting the men under arms, and the remainder only is the time available for assembling at the point of concentration. We shall conclude here also by establishing our ideas in the form of a result, such as is usual under ordinary circumstances if the distance at which the advance guard is detached is the same as the radius of the cantonments, and the point of assembly is fixed in the center of the cantonments. The time which is gained by checking the enemy's advance would be available for the transmission of intelligence and getting under arms, and would in most cases be sufficient, even although the communication is not made by means of signals, cannon shots, etc., but simply by relays of orderlies, the only really sure method. When an advance guard pushed forward 3 miles in front, our cantonments might therefore cover a space of 30 square miles. In a moderately peopled country, there would be 10,000 houses in this space, which, for an army of 50,000, after deducting the advance guard, would be 4 men to a billet, therefore very comfortable quarters, and for an army of twice the strength, 9 men to a billet, therefore still not very close quarters. On the other hand, if the advance guard is only one mile in front, we could only occupy a space of 4 square miles. For although the time gained does not diminish exactly in proportion as the distance of the advanced guard diminishes, and even with a distance of 1 mile we may still calculate on a gain of 6 hours, yet the necessity for caution increases when the enemy is so close. But in such a space an army of 50,000 men could not only find partial accommodation, even in a very thickly populated country. From all this we see that an important part is played here by great or at least considerable towns which afford convenience for sheltering 10,000 or even 20,000 men almost at one point. From this result it follows that if we are not very close to the enemy and have a suitable advance guard, we might remain in cantonments even if the enemy is concentrated, as Frederick the Great did at Breslau in the beginning of the year 1762, and Bonaparte at Vitebsk in 1812. But although by preserving a right distance and by suitable arrangements we have no reason to fear not being able to assemble in time, even opposite an enemy who is concentrated, yet we must not forget that an army engaged in assembling itself in all haste can do nothing else in that time. It is therefore, for a time at least, not in a condition to avail itself, in an instant, of fortuitous opportunities which deprives it of the greater part of its really efficient power. The consequence of this, that an army should only break itself up completely in cantonments under some one or other of the three following cases. 1. If the enemy does the same. 2. If the condition of the troops makes it unavoidable. 3. If the more immediate object with the army is completely limited to the maintenance of a strong position, and therefore the only point of importance is concentrating the troops at that point in good time. The campaign of 1815 gives a very remarkable example of the assembly of an army from cantonments. General Ziethen, with Blücher's advance guard, 30,000 men, was posted at Charleroi, only 2 miles from Sombref, the place appointed for the assembly of the army. The farthest cantonments of the army were about 8 miles from Sombref, that is, on the one side beyond Ciney, and on the other near Liège. Notwithstanding this, the troops cantoned about Ciney were assembled at Ligny several hours before the battle began, and those near Liège, Bülow's corps, would have been also, had it not been for accident and faulty arrangements in the communication of orders and intelligence. Unquestionably, proper care for the security of the Prussian army was not taken. But in explanation we must say that the arrangements were made at a time when the French army was still dispersed or widely extended cantonments, and that the real fault consisted in not altering them the moment the first news was received that the enemy's troops were in movement, and that Bonaparte had joined the army. Still, it remains noteworthy that the Prussian army was able in any way to concentrate Sombref before the attack of the enemy. Certainly, on the night of the 14th, that is 12 hours before Ziethen was actually attacked, Blücher received information of the advance of the enemy and began to assemble his army. But on the 15th at 9 in the morning, Ziethen was already hotly engaged, and it was not until the same moment that General Thielmann at Ciney first received orders to march to Namur. He had therefore then to assemble his divisions and to march 6.5 miles to Sombref, which he did in 24 hours. General Bülow would also have been able to arrive about the same time if the order had reached him as it should have done. But Bonaparte did not resolve to make his attack on Ligny until 2 in the afternoon of the 16th. The apprehension of having Wellington on the side of him and Blücher on the other, in other words, the disproportion in the relative forces, contributed to his slowness. Still, we see how the most resolute commander may be detained by the cautious feeling of the way which is always unavoidable, in cases which are to a certain degree complicated. Some of the considerations here raised are plainly more tactical than strategic in their nature, but we have preferred rather to encroach a little than to run the risk of not being sufficiently explicit. So today essentially we complete the chapter we began last time. So Von Clausewitz at this point begins still to talk about the nature, how the disposition of cantonments, as we were finishing to say last time. He says, what now remains to be said as to an advantageous position for cantonments is that they should be taken up behind some natural obstacle of ground, affording cover, right? Whilst the sides next to the enemy can be watched by small but numerous detached parties, or they may be taken up behind fortresses which, when circumstances prevent an estimate being formed of the strength of their garrisons, impose upon the enemy a greater feeling of respect and caution, right? That is to say, cantonments should naturally exploit some, terrain obstacle that puts them in security, and even when there is essentially a fortress, you can deploy, can put cantonments in behind it and scatter, even certain parties around, so that together they represent kind of a system of defense, which is not properly meant to be so, but that makes it more difficult to simply attack the fortress, and makes you think that there's maybe, in fact, troops that can arrive at the moment, or can simply slow you down. Also, if there are outposts around the same fortress and so on. Also, it says, we reserve the subject of winter quarters covered by defensive works for a separate article, so we'll see it in another point. Then he says, the quarters taken up by troops on a march differ from those called standing cantonments in this way, that in order to save the troops from unnecessary marching, cantonments on a march are taken up as much as possible along the lines of march, and are not at any considerable distance on either side of these roads. If their extension in this sense does not exceed a short day's march, the arrangement is not one at all favorable to the quick concentration of the army. So, naturally, as we've seen, that these armies tend to be on the march as much as possible. So, in order to be readily available, they should be cantoned pretty close to, not just to each other, but also to the line of communication to resume the march. All right, at a distance that really actually makes an important difference, because as we've seen in previous chapters, to the calculation of the march, you have to literally calculate how much time it takes for the troops to be recalled. When they're at the end of the day of march, they have to scatter each other in countryside, and this can take a considerable time, right? So they're actually strained more than it should, and there is properly a time which that takes to make them put all together. This is we don't analyze it here, but conceive it even just in terms of practicality, right? Even arriving in places that you do not concretely know, and that, yes, I mean, the larger the army is, paradoxically, the better idea from a strategical point of view should have where you are deploying them, right? Because of supplies and maintenance and so on. But this proximity to the road is crucial at that point, because it really makes everything more simple. Then Foucault says, in all cases in presence of the enemy, according to the technical phrasing used, that is, in all cases where there is no considerable interval between the advance guards of the two armies respectively, the extent of the cantonments and the time required to assemble the army determine the strength and position of the advanced guard and outposts, right? Because this naturally influences the capability of troops to eventually come to their support, to reinforce them, or maybe they're just even properly the same troops that constitute the advanced guard, right? And the outposts, aside from those who are on guard duties, but people have to sleep, have to eat, right? So this is naturally especially in this historical time, an important eventuality, because there isn't much of positional warfare as we've seen. This situation can escalate very quickly, and therefore cantonments are crucial, because in a few space, a lot can happen from that regard. We've seen the importance of vanguards, also in preventing sheltering the rest of the army from possible enemy attacks. So this has actually a lot of consideration required in the theory of the art of war, and in practice, of course. And Foucault says, but when these, that is, the advanced guard and outposts, must be suited to the enemy and circumstances, then on the contrary, the extent of the cantonments must depend on the time which we can count upon the resistance of the advanced guard, right? So, of course, conversely, the army must take into consideration, because it can't really make a difference, once again, in times and space earned, in energy saved, how much it takes even just for a vanguard to be overrun normally, which, as we have seen, is also properly something that happens. I mean, that is expected even, for the canton troops to eventually be deployed in time for combat, right? So that properly, these are very, very important aspects, because it's literally how much time these troops have to refresh before you can send them in combat, and given their state, it's very meaningful. Then von Clausewitz says, in the third, that is the 8th chapter of this book, we have stated how this resistance, in the case of an advanced corps, may be estimated. In fact, we're referring about it before. Then von Clausewitz says, from the time of that resistance, we must deduct the time required for transmission of reports and getting the men under arms, and the remainder only is the time available for assembling at the point of concentration. Right? So sometimes you can't mathematically make it. I mean, physics is not an opinion. So and here we do not have specific examples, I mean, of calculations, right? But the question is pretty serious, right? It can really make the difference between victory and defeat, right? Because honestly, before reading this, how often do you ever think about something like this, right? You maybe thought about this, but in more mechanicistic functions, that I need a defense or something. But here we're talking about actual times of calculating. And the fascinating thing of it is that it's being told to you in armies that already have an important mass, historically speaking, so that you can't, they make you understand how even fortifications altogether not even that important anymore, and how this calculation is mostly measured on the sheer variables of time and space, right? The number of men. That at that point make you realize how the most important thing is really the complications that arise from maintaining this man, right? And how to arrange and how to organize them. Because I mean, time and space cannot be changed. At the end of the day, what you are doing is how you manage the man, right? So that is crucial in insight, and it's what it's being told here, essentially. Then von Clausewitz says, we shall conclude here also by establishing our ideas in the form of a result, such as is usual under ordinary circumstances. Yes, because these things, at the end of the day, are very concrete. So it's not just, things always change, but were we to draw like an estimate, quantitatively speaking, how does it usually happen? So von Clausewitz says, if the distance at which the advanced guard is detached is the same as the radius of the cantonments, and the point of assembly is fixed in the center of the cantonments, the time which is gained by checking the enemy's advance would be available for the transmission of intelligence and getting under arms. It would in most cases be sufficient, even although the communication is not made by means of signals, cannon shots, but simply by relative orderlies, the only really sure method. Right? So this is interesting because it gives you properly the superficial, the extensional dimension of this phenomenon, right? You have an area of cantonment, and means the troops are scattered all over, and the enemy is in one direction, and that's the same. You have your vanguard is stationed. So von Clausewitz is saying that normally, if the if by the time the enemy reaches your vanguards, you have enough time for. So the vanguard is basically established in this perimeter. Think about it as a circle, right, or a square, as also von Clausewitz says. So imagine that the array, right, is in fact the distance that all the troops maximum have to cross to reach in the center of this area, right? So that's pretty much it. So you understand the cantonments. The circle, say, has as array the same distance normally is between the concentration, and it overlaps on it, but by the way, the point of concentration and where the vanguard is stationed. So also this means that the vanguard is normally stationed next, to the area of cantonment properly, right, at the end of it, the margin of it. So this is generally speaking, of course, and von Clausewitz naturally is pretty aware of this. So von Clausewitz then says, with an advance guard pushed forward 3 miles in front, our cantonments might therefore cover a space of 30 square miles, right? there are all calculations, even in modern times. I use them sometimes for my works too as well. Calculating the area of encampment of an army is fascinating, right? And also just calculating the sheer amount of water and food that is required, right? And that gives you a dimension of how complicated logistics is. Then Von Clausewitz says, in a moderately peopled country, there would be 10,000 houses in this space, which for an army of 50,000, after deducting the advance guard, would be 4 men to build it, therefore very comfortable quarters. Which means that at the end of the day, in Europe, at the early 19th century, well, the average place would be kind of good just for building the troops. Naturally, here Von Clausewitz is talking about areas that have not been ravaged yet, right? Or at least if we're talking just about the houses that are still standing, right? This doesn't take into consideration how much food there is in there, how many people. These are all factors that, as you understand, do matter, right? But here it's, I think it's all included, given the average situations here. Or maybe towards the brightest side. I mean, in an area that's still not be spoiled by war. I mean, and Foucault says, in for an army of twice the strength, 9 men to a billet, therefore still not very close quarters. So still acceptable. On the other hand, if the advance guard is only 1 mile in front, we could only occupy a space of 4 square miles, for although the time gained does not diminish exactly in proportion as the distance of the advance guard diminishes, and even with a distance of 1 mile we may still calculate on a gain of 6 hours, yet the necessity for caution increases when the enemy is so close, right? But in such a space, an army of 50,000 men could only find a partial accommodation, even in a very thickly populated country. Because naturally, the bigger these units are, and the longer it takes, as we've seen, to knock them out. So this gives naturally an extra time to assemble. So here, I don't know if you skipped something even before, but the concept, as far as I understand it, is this one, right? The idea that naturally the vanguard can vary in size compared to the rest of the army. So also that proportion must be taken into consideration, because it's as we've seen, the larger the vanguard is, the more time it can buy. At the same time, also the more energy it's spent. I mean, the more troops it spends, right? So here it's aside from the surface of land you want to occupy for building the troops. The question remains, more importantly, also about the actual size of troops employed in the vanguard, and that is to be borne in mind. Then von Clausewitz says, from all this we see what an important part is played here by a great, or at least considerable, towns which afford convenience for sheltering 10,000 or even 20,000 men almost at one point, right? So it's obvious that the more concentrated resources are locally for troops to be maintained, the better it is, right? Because the nature of settlements at the end of the day is exactly this one, concentrating people that can live there and can be maintained. It's obvious that a specific city, a specific town is way better than just, the same amount of houses and people and supplies, but scattered on a larger area, right? Because there you have all the troops concentrated, and it takes much less to assemble them wherever you have to deploy them. This is kind of obvious, but still, it does make an important difference. So now von Clausewitz makes an historical example, actually multiple examples. It says, from this result it follows that if we are not very close to the enemy and have a suitable advance guard, we might remain in cantonments even if the enemy is concentrated, right? This is very important. If you have, even if the enemy is very close and concentrated, you can literally calculate the time it will take, and you may even have, in some cases, enough supplies locally to remain fundamentally, maintaining troops in cantonments for a long time, right, before the vanguard is taken out. And Von Clausewitz makes an example: Frederick the Great at Breslau at the beginning of the year 1762, and Bonaparte at Vitebsk in 1812. And then he says, but although by preserving a right distance and by suitable arrangements we have no reason to fear not being able to assemble in time, even opposite an enemy who is concentrated, yet we must not forget that an army engaged in assembling itself in all haste can do nothing else in that time. So consider carefully how much it takes. It is therefore, for a time at least, not in a condition to avail itself in an instant of fortuitous opportunities, which deprives it of the greater part of its relificent power. The consequence of this is that an army should only break itself up completely in cantonments under some one or other of three following cases. 1. If the enemy does the same. 2. If the condition of the troops makes it unavoidable. 3. If the more immediate object with the army is completely limited to the maintenance of a strong position, and therefore the only point of importance is concentrating the troops at that point in good time. Right? So these are all cases in which basically you have to stay ready for especially enemy movements, whichever other objective you have in mind, that concern chiefly the problem that the enemy gains an advantage if he has already broken camp. Then you over you, right? That still has to do it, right? So do not get with time. Do not think that it's simply there, and that in most military situations this is fundamentally not influencing this. We have seen how, for example, how initiative is not to be left to the enemy at any time, and how this would be otherwise detrimental for you. Well, this has to do with exactly this capacity of the enemy. Also, that most of the time you have no idea what he's doing, but of course it's somewhat clear whether he has left camp or not sometimes. And if he's still around, well, that's fundamentally if you're still in cantonments, well, that may take an important time for you to break your own camp in turn and be ready for battle. The point. So always stay, very ready for any possible move that you may not be able to counter, and act accordingly. Now, Von Clausewitz says the campaign of 1815 gives a very remarkable example of the assembly of an army from cantonments. General Zieten, with Blücher's advance guard, 30,000 men, was posted at Charleroi, only 2 miles from Saint-Bref, the place appointed for the assembly of the army. The farthest cantonments of the army were about 8 miles from Saint-Bref, that is, on the one side beyond Ciney, and the other near Liège. Notwithstanding this, the troops cantoned about Ciney were assembled at Ligny several hours before the battle began, and those near Liège, Bülow's corps, would have been also had it not been for accident and faulty arrangements in the communication of orders and intelligence. Unquestionably, proper care for the security of the Prussian army was not taken, but in explanation we must say that the arrangements were made at a time when the French army was still dispersed over widely extended cantonments, and that the real fault consisted in not altering them in the moment the first news was received that the enemy's troops were in movement and that Bonaparte had joined the army. Right. So this represents, a good situation we were saying before, because here troops were somewhat scattered and didn't assemble properly, but also the French were very much scattered, so there was less. Consider that all these haste naturally causes pressure on your troops, and that also consumes further resources you may need at all times at some point. So at the same time, the mistake was also not moving immediately as soon as it was recognized that the French were starting their move, right, and that were joined by major forces. that is particularly important. Then von Clausewitz says, still, it remains noteworthy that the Prussian army was able in any way to concentrate its some breath before the attack of the enemy. So they actually made it in the end. Certainly on the night of the 14th, that is 12 hours before Zieten was actually attacked, Blücher received information of the advance of the enemy and began to assemble his army. But on the 15th at 9 in the morning, Zieten was already hotly engaged, and it was not until the same moment that General Thielmann de Ciney first received orders to march to Namur. He had therefore then to assemble his divisions and to march 6.5 miles to Saint-Bref, which he did in 24 hours. General Bülow would also have been able to arrive about the same time if the order had reached him as it should have done. Then von Clausewitz says, but Bonaparte did not. So this gives you also a dimension of how naturally information intelligence is important, how much news travel, what's the general awareness on the enemy moves, etc. So that we're talking about real. I mean, this was a campaign of 1815. I mean, one of the major ones, and where so much was at stake. So that this tells you, and from armies that had been essentially fighting at this point for the world Napoleonic wars, as they would have been, in fact, we end this campaign, and therefore, everybody was pretty used to the current type of warfare. So these were experienced commands. But Bonaparte did not resolve to make his attack on Ligny until 2 in the afternoon of the 16th. The apprehension of having Wellington on one side of him and Blücher on the other, in other words, the disproportion in relative terms, contributed to his slowness. So other strategical factor that alleviated the mistakes of assembly. Still, we see how the most resolute commander, as Napoleon, may be detained by the cautious feeling of the way, which is always unavoidable in cases which are to a certain degree complicated. So, reflect on how much actually goes wrong all the time in military operations, right? We have actually never explained, in operational terms, what's the planning, difficulty. In terms of actual risk calculation, I mean, nobody ever plans things as saying, everything will go well, right? There is always margin for not just for defeat altogether, but for every single damn thing to go wrong. And you can't calculate everything. This is the Clausewitzian doctrine, the theory in a nutshell, and that's why, even though you can definitely have a doctrine or a good plan that gives you some security, at the same time, when you're there, you're out there on your own for most things, and that's why you need a person that is able. And this gives you the example of how even the most resolute of commanders reasonably freaked out because it was in the condition, as it eventually would, telling the truth, to lose because of the conjunction of the British Prussians. Now, von Clausewitz concludes by saying some of these considerations here raised are plainly more tactical than strategic in their nature. True, in the sense that this has to do, naturally, it's both at the same time, right? It's strategical because it brings where you are going to fight, but at the same time, it's specifically calculating how quickly your troops can be ready to fight. Because at the end of the day, that's why you calculate what we have talked about today. This probably how ready your troops are, in how much time are they going to be ready, and how you are fundamentally capable to engage the enemy in the same ground, and how the enemy can do is one and the same, right? And then he says, but we have preferred rather to encroach a little than to run the risk of not being sufficiently explicit, and so this was the end. But these are important aspects, right? And consider that now we have been talking about actually a lot of stuff. It's not so many problems we have to take in consideration every time during waging of war. And next chapter will be even more eloquent because it's the 14th on subsistence, that has lots of subsections that take into consideration various aspects that in terms of supplies that are needed to, and how they impact as the properly from a strategical and tactical point of view. The theory of the art of war, that, as we've seen, does not include logistics, right? And that has, however, an impact on it, right? Always remember this, that logistics technically is not part of the theory of the art of war, because it probably has nothing to do with the employment of the armed forces that you give for granted to be already fit for what they have to do, right? But at the same time, you need, of course, to organize such things, because you can't even have an entire war won not actually on such things, but that where these things definitely contribute importantly, and that and that, however, have an impact, in fact, specifically on the, not just on how the war goes, but how on things you have to actively do in terms of the employment of your armed forces, aside from the organization specifically of the supplies and logistics, but how you have properly to move your troops, how much it requires, and it's going to impact your maneuvers altogether, your movements altogether. But we'll see it next time. For now, just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.